my speech last night, and then I said, don't read it, because I figured it would be better if he only heard it once and didn't read it ahead of time. But I think it's harder on our families than it is for us as individuals, and I think that you're correct that it does impact what we do and don't do in the house, in anticipation of what might happen out in the real world.
Thank you very much, Ms. Danoff. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of the second panel. I do just want to take a moment, and as I look around the table and online, and I want to thank Ms. Rempel-Garner, Ferrari, Matheson, Khalid, Demov, Romanado, and Gaudreau in particular, because I do appreciate that life in politics, as difficult as it is certainly more difficult for women. I think we've heard that exemplified here today in some brave and courageous testimony. I can't imagine it was easy to share on all sides of the aisle. And I know that many of us men who are subject, sure, to certain things are never diminished as a result of our gender. And that is something that is very specific to our female colleagues. And I do... just on a point of order for that, I'd just like for the record to say that I don't feel like my experience has been diminished by my gender. So I just want to put that on the record. Thanks. Fair enough, yeah. And sorry, Mr. Rempel-Garner, I meant to say that
Thanks.
On our behalf. Colleagues, we're going to suspend briefly, and we are then going to go into our final panel. Thank you. Acknowledge that we have gone over, and I did my best to be fair to all sides in relation to the amount of speaking time that they got. Having said that, I appreciate that it can be challenging to our respective schedules when we go further than we intend. So what I propose, and I'm looking around the room to make sure that there is some agreement to this, is that we get a full round in of questioning, and then we evaluate where we're at the end of that round in terms of what members' responsibilities may be. It's always possible, of course, for myself to stick around and for some other members to stick around as well and acknowledge that there won't be voting on certain procedures or anything, but that we have an informal part of the meeting that can continue with witnesses. I think we can discuss that when we get there, but I do want to try to be respectful to everybody's schedule. So let's get going, and then folks are welcome to come and talk to me at the outset here and see where they want to go. With that, I would like to welcome the witnesses on our next panel. And apologies, colleagues, I have to find my notes. So I would like to welcome Julie Lalonde, a public educator, to the committee today. And I don't have the other name here. And Sabrina Delhan, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Samara Center for Democracy. Sorry, colleagues, the notes were printed before there were changes to the list. Ms. Lalonde, I'm going to go to you first for 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then Ms. Delhan, 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we're going to get into our line of questioning. So the floor is over to you, Ms. Lalonde.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm delighted that Samara was added to the list because their work is actually something I was going to reference because they do incredibly important work. So thank you for the invitation. Je m'appelle Julie S. Lalonde et je vous remercie.
Thank you. My name is Julie Lalonde. I've been working for more than 20 years to put an end to gender-based violence in Canada. I worked directly with victims and survivors as a counselor in sexual assault centers. I've drafted several policies and procedures for various organizations, and I also have trained thousands and thousands of Canadians, and I do this every year, on how they should intervene to create safer communities. I've never been a staffer or worked in politics, but I have trained MPs, MPPs, staffers, and interns from across all parties at the provincial and federal levels.
Concerns that I've received and heard from staff and interns over the years of doing those trainings. So the primary concern is around defining the actual issues at hand. And I observed Tuesday's meeting, and I was here this morning, and I see that that is a continuous conversation happening here. So if I said to you, the solution to harassment is orange, we can all nod our heads and be like, great, that sounds like an awesome plan. We leave here, ready to tackle the problem. But the issue is that half of you were thinking of the fruit, and the other half were thinking of the color, but all of you were convinced that you were heading in the right direction, and the same direction. So in reading the policy and the code of conduct, and in listening to the previous committee meetings, as I said, there seems to remain much confusion about what exactly constitutes harassment and what to do if it happens to you or someone that you work with. And this brings me to the second common concern I hear from primarily staffers and interns is, okay, now what? There remains much confusion as to who exactly to report harassment to, what confidentiality looks like in that process, what accountability looks like in that process, etc. Knowledge is power, and we cannot expect people to come forward as targets of harassment or as bystanders. And I will emphasize that several times over, the importance of bystanders in this conversation. We cannot expect them to come forward if they're in the dark on what happens next. The House of Commons needs what is referred to as a no wrong door policy, which encourages people to disclose to anyone they trust to figure out how to handle feelings of unsafety or concern. Finally, I've heard much frustration from members and staffers and interns that there remains a failure to recognize 21st century realities. And this has been named quite a few times. So what happens online does matter. If you were to bank somewhere where you could not do online banking, you would be furious. So to pretend that what happens on the internet is not real is naive in 2024. Coordinated mob attacks, whether they are via bots or individuals, do impact one's ability to do their job. Those on the front lines of managing social media, as was referenced earlier today, those who are answering the emails, answering the phone calls, who are behind your Twitter accounts, behind your Facebook accounts, those folks need to be protected and they need to be supported in their difficult roles. The work members and their staffers do is also incredibly mobile and often changes day to day, and so there needs to be an understanding written into policies and procedures that all harassment is unacceptable, whether it happened in the house, at the office, or at a community meet and greet barbecue. We are living in increasingly volatile times, and that needs to be reflected in your policies and your work here. Finally, I'm happy to speak on best practices for violence prevention and culture change. That is my area of expertise. But most importantly, I want to convey the urgency in getting this conversation right. We all have the right to a safe and equitable workplace, but members of Parliament are also setting an example for Canadians. Getting it right here sends a message that civility matters, that we can disagree with each other without veering into personal attack, and that conflicts can be resolved in a way where everyone is able to move forward. Creating a safer House of Commons means creating a more democratic House of Commons, and that benefits all of us. Merci.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lalonde. Ms. Dellon, we'll go to you for up to 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to speak with the committee today. My name is Sabrina Dellon, and I'm the CEO of the Samara Centre for Democracy, which is a nonpartisan charity dedicated to making Canada's democratic culture more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. We have been studying the lived experience of elected officials for over 15 years through our MP Exit interview project, which has produced several publications and 2 podcasts. This material serves as a key resource for aspiring politicians, is used by high school and post-secondary educators across the country to teach about active citizenship, and it's received extensive media attention. Over 160 exit interviews have been conducted with former members of Parliament since 2008, and today I'll be drawing on our most recent cohort of interviews to guide potential changes to the workplace harassment and violence prevention policy. In these interviews, former MPs across parties have expressed concerns that their conditions of work create significant barriers to achieving a parliament that is representative of Canadian society. They call for modernization in the form of more flexibility, stronger HR policies, and formalized protocols to prevent harassment. Our interviewees feel that these changes are crucial in order to attract and retain parliamentarians. This was a defining theme in this group, more so than in previous cohorts. MPs repeatedly shared concerns that a failure to improve Parliament as a workplace would undermine the faith and trust that Canadians have in this institution. The way forward isn't through policies alone, but through the formation of a healthy culture that can reverse this normalization of an increasingly hostile environment on and offline. This requires considering the following questions. What are the rewards for good behavior? How are parties incentivized to contribute to civility and collegiality? And what other healthy boundaries can be put into place to foster a more productive condition of work? I'll turn now to specific feedback about the working conditions from former MPs. Encountering racialized comments were identified by interviewees as a significant risk when serving in the House of Commons. This problem was compounded by the absence of mechanisms to address these instances, which brought forth a sense of alienation. In terms of gender equity, harassment of younger women MPs was brought up as a point of concern amongst a number of our interviewees, both men and women. And some interviewees spoke of the negative effects of harassment or bullying during question period, which they connected to the broader harassment and silencing of women and underrepresented groups in the political arena. The effect of online harassment of MPs was also a recurring theme. Our interviewees explained how harassment affected their mental health and extended to their families. This is a particular concern from those that are from minoritized communities who receive a high volume of online abuse. Recently, we've seen numerous politicians at all orders of government leave the political arena because of hate and harassment that came to define their job. This isn't just about having a thick skin or being more resilient. In our interviews, the women we spoke with frequently mentioned receiving death threats and struggling to get the appropriate security that they required. If safer working conditions aren't put into place, then the leaders that we need, the leaders that reflect Canada's diverse communities, won't stay, or they'll stop stepping forward altogether. The context I've outlined here takes a significant toll on staff and has a chilling effect on public engagement. People are pushed away from democratic engagement instead of being drawn in. None of our interviewees regret devoting years to public service, and they share their stories with us to help evolve life in Parliament. In this period of global democratic backsliding, it's never been more urgent to secure healthy conditions of civic engagement. We're willing to partner to support a safer and more inclusive workplace should the committee see a role for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dellin. We appreciate the opening statement. Ms. Rempel-Garner, I'll speak slowly. The first round of questioning will go to you for 6 minutes. Okay.
My apologies for the cornbread. It's really good, by the way. I encourage all of you to avail yourself of lunch on Spark Street today. But on to serious matters. I think what we should be trying to do here is drive to recommendations that affect change. One of the frustrations that I've had over the course of my hot minute career is the weekly request for an interview on how do you feel about being a woman in politics and blah, blah, blah. And I have yet to have an interview to respond to substantive changes that would improve some of these issues. So I'd like to go to recommendations. The CBC reported about 2 weeks ago that the RCMP was recommending stronger measures to protect members of Parliament from online harassment and abuse. And my reaction was, if you can't protect me, how can you protect other Canadian women? And we know that online harassment is a behavior that escalates into physical violence. It creates anxiety, lack of productivity, numerous other impacts in the family. So I'd like to focus recommendations on ways to prevent that writ large. There's 3 recommendations I'd like the committee to consider. First, that the loophole under the gray area under Canada's current intimate image distribution laws that does not explicitly include deepfakes, that be closed and that language be put in the criminal code, particularly ahead of the next federal election. Would you both agree with that recommendation?
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that.
From Samara? Okay. The next thing I'd like to see is that there's a gap. There's 2 gaps. First of all, oftentimes this type of harassment comes from anonymous sources. And I'm not talking about like a singular, a mean tweet, objecting to a policy position, or even calling me a name. It is repetitive harassment from the same person. Oftentimes, as was mentioned by one of the previous witnesses, and not just for MPs, but like for all women, there will be a time where the law enforcement will go, well, I'm not sure what we can do about that. To the point that Ms. Lalonde made, it's very difficult to even know where to call when you are being harassed by somebody online. So I would like to recommend, or I would just like to get your position on recommending that in instances of clear, repeated harassment, defining it along the lines of what constitutes criminal harassment, but that a judge could issue an order to social media companies to provide the identity of a person so that justice could be followed out. Would you recommend that?
I absolutely would recommend that as a member of civil society who cannot speak in public without a security detail because of the amount of death threats I receive for my work on ending violence against women in Canada. And I have had rare occasions where folks have been criminalized for their behavior. But to your point, I absolutely agree that if a member of parliament cannot get justice for someone who is repeatedly harassing them, how do we expect a 25-year-old single mother who's being harassed by an intimate partner but using fake aliases online to get justice? So absolutely, there needs to be a stronger mechanism. And that, to me, is part of the broader conversation around social media platforms are an industry. They need to be regulated. The fact that I can't see news on Instagram and Facebook tells me the government has made attempts to regulate those industries, but they haven't made any headway when it comes to exactly the topic that you were talking about today.
And I'm looking at low-hanging fruit that the government could, implement in short order. I know that there's a bill before Parliament that has received a lot of controversial scrutiny. It looks at setting up a very big bureaucracy that's years out. That debate hasn't started in Parliament yet, so I'm going to focus my remarks on things we could do in very short order within the existing criminal code to get justice. So that would be my second thing, and I'll go to Samara in a second, but I want to put the last recommendation that I have. So let's say that came to pass where there was a tool by which if a behavior online had reached a certain threshold, that an order could be given to social media platforms to disclose identity, right? And I'm not talking about for freedom, it's harassing behavior. The next thing is what's to be done about it, okay? So in those scenarios, what often happens is that identity might come out, people might know it's happening, but there's this gray area on whether or not the person can continue to contact you. And oftentimes what will happen is one account might be shut down, but then there's another, it's very easy to create a different email address, right? It's difficult to block people that are constantly harassing. So in that scenario, when there's a threshold of behavior reached as determined by the court, would you recommend that, I'll use a term that would have to be defined, but that a judge could issue an online restraining order that would prevent almost in perpetuity a person, if the judge so deemed it, that person from contacting somebody by any means online so that that behavior stops and it is a tool to de-escalate that behavior into violence. Would you either of you recommend that?
Witnesses, just to let you know, and I'm sorry to rush, about 30 seconds or so on the response. Thank you.
I would say, yeah, we should put conditions on people who are threatening people's lives. That shouldn't be controversial.
Samara?
I would agree, and I would add that there needs to be a public education component to this because people don't know where they're supposed to go for recourse, whether that's to the platform itself or to the police. Education for judges would also be necessary here in order to have the appropriate level of digital literacy to navigate this terrain. And we also want to see tech platforms have better content moderation practices so this isn't an issue in the first place, and to also reduce the amount of times that someone can be anonymous online.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ms. Adama, for 6 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I want to thank both of the witnesses here today for the work that you've done. Ms. Lalonde, I've read your book. I follow your posts, and myself and my staff did your bystander training. And you do amazing work. And you do it in spite of the the threats and harassment that you get. So I just would personally like to thank you. The Mayor of Burlington, Ontario, Marianne Mead Ward, brought together all of the women who are elected in Halton Region. And she's been doing this for a few years, and after I announced that I wasn't running again, she drafted up a pledge that was signed by, I think it's 2122 women in Halton Region. I just want to read it, that we, the women of HER, which is Halton elected representatives, 1, pledge to support each other and call out abuse and harassment when we see it or experience it. 2, call on our allies to stand with us to support women in office and call out all forms of abuse and harassment. 3, call on elected officials to uphold the highest standards of conduct, focusing on respectful debate on the issues and not personal attacks. And 4, call on the relevant authorities to ensure the protection of individuals who speak out against abuse and who experience abuse, providing them with the necessary support and resources. Ms. Lalonde, I'm going to start with you because I feel that touches a little bit on the type of bystander training that you do. And so a lot of times as MPs, we don't call out others on what is put out into the public sphere. I'm just wondering if you can maybe comment on your thoughts on that pledge and whether you think it would be helpful. And then I'll turn to Samara.
I think certainly it would be helpful. I mean, it's an all hands on deck situation, and to assume that there's some sort of silver bullet that's going to solve everything, it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. But I do think that it bodes really well when you see cross-party support around these issues. So to call out how another member was treated, regardless of whether or not they're part of your team, that shows that civility is important, that we have respect. And to speak to the point that was made earlier, I know that behind the cameras, folks are going out for lunch, they're having chit-chats, and that's important that you're checking in with each other. But being more open and public about those gestures, right, normalizing that behavior, by definition encourages bystanders. But I think it shows that it's not about partisanship, it's about civility, and it's about safety, fundamentally. Like, yes, we know women and folks of color are predominantly being targeted in politics, but when you see the vitriol, nobody wants to join that club. Like, it is not, your job does not look appealing from the outside. I'm here to tell you, like, at all. And that's a problem for democracy, right? And so I think any attempt, even if it comes across initially as lip service, of cross-party calling this stuff out is powerful stuff, and I would like to see more of it. And I'll pass it to Sabrina.
We know from our exit interviews that MPs are collegial. You are friends. You do have lunch. You do have group chats together. And the public would like to see a lot more of that side of the job. These types of pledges, Ms. Damoff, are certainly helpful, but I don't think we need to see a kind of flattening or segmenting of the experience across race or gender lines all the time. That can be useful to help us set a baseline for improvements or to get some necessary context. But I think we want to see, and the public wants to see, all MPs demonstrating collegiality and civility towards each other. And it's not just the burden of those who are experiencing the most violence to stick up for each other and protect each other. There's a role for everyone to play to demonstrate the kind of productive and collegial workspace that we know can exist, that does exist in a lot of the time, and that needs to be more visible to the public.
I forgot to set my timer, Chair. How much time have I got left?
That's enough.
Okay, thank you. To your point, I think we did see a lot of that when Karen Vecchio was removed as chair of the Status of Women Committee, and you saw MPs from all parties and the public, quite frankly, but MPs from all parties speaking out about the good work that she had done, and you don't often see that displayed publicly. So, point well taken. Do you think that as MPs we have a responsibility to set the tone for the public? Some of this discourse is going to happen anyway, but do we have a responsibility to set the tone ourselves and set examples for the public?
Would you like me to answer
Sure.
that? Yeah, okay. Yes, the answer is yes.
Not to rush, Ms. Dillon, but please, as concisely as you can. Thank you.
Yes, we need to see MPs modeling the behavior. Teachers are currently embarrassed to bring their students to question period because they don't want to expose their students to that behavior. Nobody wants that. That's not the kind of environment that we want for our democracy to function in. So yes, there is a role to model that behavior online and offline.
Thank you very much. Madame Gaudreau, parole à vous pour...
Ms. Gaudreau, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question, and we've seen that over the last hour, we've seen a demonstration of courage. I don't know if you've been able to listen, but we saw examples where we spoke about misogynistic verbal violence. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask this question to Ms. Lalonde. So I'd like to hear you speak about the increasing misogynist speech that we're hearing today. Well, you mean the freedom to speak about misogyny? Is that what you mean? No, the freeing of it. That is, it's transformed. Decades ago, it was unacceptable, and today, we're in another space. That is, where this can contribute to somebody's search for power to show that one is misogynist, and we show it. Well, it's, as was mentioned this morning, it's just not because when we speak about experiencing harassment as a woman that we're told that it's not true in some cases, but even in some cases we're just told, well, tough luck. Figure it out. If you can't do this, you don't have the necessary confidence, you don't have the tough skin required, maybe this isn't for you. But when men have mental health crises, people say, oh my goodness, the courage you have, etc., etc. I think it's also part of the problem. It isn't just that we as women are more often targets of harassment, but it's the fact that we've lost the right to speak about it in a free fashion without being told, look, it's not true, you're just too weak to do this job. I think that is where the problem lies. What happens is often women decide, look, I don't want to identify as a woman. I don't want to be identified as an MP who's also a woman. I just want to be identified as an MP. Well, yes, but misogynists will say, well, don't forget that you are a woman. So it's our freedom to speak about it is compromised at this point, and that greatly concerns me because that is part of the freedom of speech, of expression. Often we're speaking about ending harassment. People say, well, what's going to happen to the freedom of expression? Well, what happens to my freedom of expression right now? Because I can't talk about feminism in public without having a security officer next to me. What does this say? Thank you. So a question for Ms. Dillon. I'm very pleased that you're closely following politics. But why is it that this environment is being tolerated? It's even accepted. I'd like to hear you speak about this. On the one hand, we have citizens asking us to change our conduct and asking us to be civilized. Others, on the other hand, say, well, no, just, go for it. Rammer. So what underlies this? What are the causes?
One key cause is technology's influence in our democracy, particularly over the last decade, where we've seen social media platforms develop content recommendation systems that favor divisive and harmful content. Harmful content, particularly what is experienced by elected officials, journalists, others who occupy, we can call them professions of democracy, are getting attacked online, and we end up seeing that material far more than any of the positive stories about civic engagement in our local communities. We've also seen a reduction in local journalism. Local newsrooms have been decimated over the last couple of years, and all of that is changing the proportion. A lot of what we're hearing about and that sense of tension and anxiety that we're experiencing right now is because the harmful material is out of proportion with our norms, and it's distorting our sense of our democratic values.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Lalonde, j'aimerais aussi vous entendre.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lalonde. I'd like to hear you speak about the effects of nonverbal behavior. So at the beginning, I was speaking about a disrespectful attitude, which is often discreet. For example, it's when we look at our phone when somebody's talking to us or not looking at that person or blatantly not listening. So every day, I'm seeing what is taking place, but I'd like to hear you speak about this. So, is this part of harassment? Yes, absolutely. So, body language has an effect on bullying. It's not just a lack of respect, as you said. That is, I'm on my phone when you're speaking to me, or I speak to somebody next to me, I'm not paying attention to you. But it's also rolling your eyes. It's body language to simply cross your arms while you're looking at somebody. It's not we're weak, but we're not silly. We know what bullying is about. We know what it means when somebody says, well, no, I haven't said a thing. Certainly, you are doing something and you need to speak out about that lack of respect. So it's not okay to say that, look, you're not allowed to move your arms. That's not it at all. I'm a francophone and I like to, throw my hands around. But let's be realistic. We are adults. Let's be realistic is that when we're speaking about a lack of respect, we know what this is about. We know what this piece is about. But we often don't have the guts to stand firm and say that is enough. To the point where, look, nothing is changing. We're going in circles. Honestly, I think we simply don't have the courage to end that discussion. Well, I hope that you're going to give us some courage and that this message will be conveyed. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lalonde. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau.
For 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses as well for joining us on this important study. I think that I struggle. We talk a lot, and I think that they're important. We talk a lot about those tools, rules and tools that we need to implement, and I think that that's very clear. But I'm also frustrated in that it seems fairly reactive. And we're not, maybe I would like to talk about the proactive. And I don't know, I've certainly worried about if that's just a matter of peer pressure. There was conversations earlier with Ms. Demoff about that bystander mentality. Could you both expand on that, though, beyond that? What else? What we have to do as members of Parliament to raise the level? And it's our own behavior, but beyond that as well?
Certainly. I would say bystander intervention training, it needs to be mandatory. It needs to be across the board. I work with a program where I teach bystander intervention to children ages 3 to 10. It's a life skill. It's like administering CPR. It's about, naloxone. Like it's a life skill of if you see someone in distress. And I want to reference something that was said earlier this morning about people are not doing well. If you take public transit, you can tell people are not doing well. If you wait in a drive-thru that takes too long, people are popping off at a rate that we've never. People are not well. And so bystander intervention skills are life skills that we need to make standard across the board. But certainly in the House of Commons, both amongst MPs, amongst members, amongst staffers, amongst interns, that's something that is by definition culture change. Because it's not putting the onus on the person who's been targeted to be the only one to raise it. It's I was there, I saw it, I'm going to say something, I'm going to set partisanship aside and say ultimately we all benefit by putting a stop to this. I would also say, although it feels reactive, to return to the point that was made earlier by Ms. Rempel-Garner, we do need to also look at how we even define harassment in terms of the criminal code, and that changing that is an opportunity for public education. Stalking has only been illegal in Canada since 1993. And until I started an organization in January, there was not a single organization in Canada's history focused on stalking. So there's nobody to talk about what this looks like to help us get into the weeds. And this is an opportunity that you have here, and that by changing that legislation, yes, it's responding, but you're raising awareness on this is what, we're not talking about people being annoying on the internet. We're talking about people threatening our lives and impeding our ability to do our jobs. So that public education piece is by definition prevention as well. So the bystander and redefining criminal harassment, in my view.
This is a self-regulating culture. So this is a time where there's pressure to be reactive and move really quickly and just be in the moment and short-sighted. But in a self-regulating environment, you can take a minute, take a pause, and really think deeply about what kind of culture do you want. in this moment of democratic backsliding, Canada has a leadership opportunity here. We can really step up on the world stage and set some new norms. The stakes are pretty high. And from our exit interviews, we hear really mundane and straightforward recommendations of what would make a difference. Start as you mean to go on. Put that culture training and piece into the onboarding process and set a code of conduct and norms at that spot, and then pair new MPs with ones that are more experienced and maintain that nonpartisan opportunity and potential throughout.
I do believe our caucus used to do that, but it was one of the many things that was lost during COVID and after. So it's an important point. I wanted to talk a bit, and I think that Ms. Goudreau was kind of getting to it a bit, but I wanted to explore it more. We heard from the two witnesses before the two MPs about extreme examples of what harassment is and what it leads to, and that verbal violence that was seen. But there are microaggressions. Can you both talk about what you've seen in terms of those, what examples of those, and how we better deal with them?
Sure, I can speak to that. So in our exit interviews, we're talking to people who aren't in the job anymore, so they can be very open and reflective about what they experienced. And their comment is often that, wow, I had all this to say and nobody's ever asked me these questions before. And then they're able to unpack all of the ways in which they felt slighted or undermined or attacked in varying ways of severity. And it's often women who are really downplaying the extent of abuse and incivility that they needed to that they encountered. And as a result, there's a lot of compartmentalization that happens. And this affects male colleagues as well, because they're bearing witness to this, they're experiencing it with colleagues that they care about. And if we think about this from a sustainability perspective, at the end of the political career, a lot of doors can be closed, and that healing and recovering from the compartmentalization that's necessary to perform this job needs to be addressed. That's a serious mental health and wellness issue. It's a public good issue. How are we taking care of our public servants after they've completed their service to us? So there's a duty of care element to this as well. So what we're talking about is not just what happens on the job. It's hard on the campaign trail. The digital campaign trail in particular can be very abusive and toxic. Very few training and supports available there. The job is hard, and then post-job is also incredibly challenging. And so there's a lot of responsibility that we need to account for across that civic journey.